Mr. Liv? All right, everyone. Uh, Good evening, good morning, good afternoon. I'm sorry for the delay. We were having some technical difficulties on our network, but I think we are now in action and I think you can see us and hear us. So, welcome to session 10 of MOOC 12, Regulatory and Tax Affairs. To me, this is actually one of the most endlessly fascinating topics for cryptocurrency and blockchain, and I'm always super disappointed by the number of people who show up because I think I must be strange, because I think tax and regulatory topics are very interesting, and uh, 12 semesters of empirical evidence suggests that the MOOC participants find this less so, because this is usually the lowest number of participants online of any session. But it's a shame because it is super intellectually interesting thinking through these topics, because cryptocurrency in particular presents very novel, very difficult, very intellectually stimulating regulatory and legal topics, because it is something that doesn't really exist in a format that people have been used to, and so a lot of the regulatory frameworks don't quite match. And so, is it a stock? Is it a security? Is it a commodity? Is it a currency? Is it a money transmission network? And the answer in many cases is yes, it's all of those things. And then, of course, the regulations aren't designed for something to be all of those things. And so you get conflicting views, and then how you resolve them is actually super interesting. But I have come to accept that I am in the minority here that thinks this is the interesting part of the course. So thank you all who joined today. I think you're on the right side of history. It's a super interesting topic. So we have a few questions, and not that many. We're definitely not going to get through the questions. I mean, we'll definitely get through the questions. And then once I get through the questions, if you have other ones in the chat, please share them. And if not, then I will just freelance on topics of regulatory interest to me. So I'll start with the first one. Having so many regulation prototypes in different countries means it is currently nearly impossible to make a globe-wide, or global, I think, compliant ICO. Does it explain the end of the ICO mega hype? The short answer to this is yes, actually. This is a super interesting topic because, on the one hand, and I think we talked about this last week, and I'm going to talk about it again, it's one of my favorite topics in cryptocurrency. ICOs for sure demonstrated that there is global retail or non-institutional or non-venture capitalist interest in a wide variety of crowd-funded projects slash potentially businesses. And when professional investors look at this, say, oh, no, that's not what it is. People were just being naive and silly and unsophisticated, and they were taken in by get-rich-quick scams, and this is why it needs to flow through the normal channels. And while I think part of that is definitely true, I think there is something real to the concept that someone can come up with an idea. That idea will appeal to a certain segment of the global population, and a certain segment of that global population can directly finance it in amounts ranging from very large amounts to $1 or anything in between, and do that instantly and then see the results of their financing. I mean, that is a super powerful concept. It is nothing we have ever seen before in the investing landscape. And I will be really surprised if over the coming decades we give up on that altogether and say, wow, that was really great. We had a moment in time for about a year where people could finance things from around the world, and now I've decided to stop that altogether. Yeah, this is the optimist's view of things. So take that as point one. Point two. Were a lot of these projects scammy? Yes. Why were they scammy? Well, because this type of super bubbly financial market tends to attract scammy operators, right? When you see that you can go out there and write a 15-page white paper and say, I'm doing blockchain for whatever, pets, or whatever the topic of the day is, and raise $20 million without having done very much, and without any particular controls on what you're going to do in that $20 million afterwards, whether you're really going to develop your super blockchain or instead have a nice life with it, that attracts the wrong type of person. So it does attract some opportunists. That's bucket one. That environment also attracts well-meaning but naive entrepreneurs who are not going out to scam someone, think their idea will work. It's a very bubbly environment, so they raise financing that they would have not raised in a more typical environment. And from the perspective of the funder of the project, it might be all the same. Like if you lose 95% of your money because it was someone actively trying to scam you, or you lose 95% of your money because you funded someone too naive to know better and they can't run the project effectively. I mean, it might be all the same to you in either case, but there is a difference in motivation. I think that does mean something. There's a third issue, though, that relates in this bucket that is a negative issue as opposed to a positive issue. A lot of experienced business operators, entrepreneurs, whatever you want to call it, look at this and say, oh, I'd love to do a project. I'd like to do an ICO. It is not clear if this is strictly legal under the current regulation. It is not clear that I am not issuing a unregistered security, or to not put it as a double negative, I might be issuing an unregistered security. And if you're of a certain level of experience and knowledge about startups, you have the experience to know that issuing unregistered securities can be a very bad thing, and you can have fines or prosecutions or, a lot of painful back and forth with the SEC, and you'd rather not do that. And so you have an environment where not only it attracted potentially questionable operators, it pushed away good ones. And in that environment, you end up with the majority of the projects being bad projects. And so then the conclusion becomes, oh, you see, this ICO thing was just a bad idea. It is why we need retail protection, and let's bring in some retail protection. And there's obviously truth to that as well. I mean, the cryptocurrency blockchain world did not cover themselves in glory during the ICO boom, right? Like there was a lot of junk that came out. But I insist there's something super important about a world where you can raise money for a project globally. So now we've gone to the next stage. People are aware that there is regulatory risk. We are out of the bubbly environment. The promoters are much more careful. So now what happens? Well, the question hits upon a critical problem. If you have a mechanism where you can raise money globally, but regulation is national in scope, it's very difficult to do a global ICO and not come into conflict with some national regulator or another. And even today, when there's some level of guidance in certain countries about what constitutes what, right? Like some people say this type of offering is okay, it's not a security. This other type of offering is a security, and here's what you need to do about it. And while that might be true in some jurisdictions, that there is sort of clear guidance, that's not true in all jurisdictions. To the degree that multiple jurisdictions have regulations, they might be contradictory. And you still have over 100 jurisdictions, maybe 150 jurisdictions, that haven't put any guidance out at all. In which case, you have this very difficult situation. So what does that mean? What does it mean today, and what does it mean in the future? So one conclusion you might say is, well, the time is still not yet right. The regulation is not mature enough to do a global ICO. And I think there's plenty of people that have taken that point of view. A second conclusion could be, I will be in a certain jurisdiction or a certain set of jurisdictions, and I will do an ICO within those jurisdictions, and I will somehow technically try to block people from other jurisdictions. And so say, all right, well, you see this with some of the exchanges. New York has the bit license, so you see exchanges with amusing policies, like you can sign up from everywhere in the world except like North Korea, Cuba, and the state of New York or something. And so you can try and do that. And does that work really well in a crypto token type offering? Not really. I mean, you can try and do it, but it's certainly not foolproof, and I think it's relatively trivial for someone to work around if they were in the state of New York and wanted to participate in your token offering. Like, I don't think it's a grand technical challenge for them to work around it. The third version, which it is not a recommendation, but I can see people potentially doing it, is saying, look, I'm in jurisdiction X. This is legal in jurisdiction X. If jurisdiction Y has a problem with it, well, I don't care. That's jurisdiction Y's problem. Is that a good idea? I don't know. It depends what jurisdiction X is, what jurisdiction Y is. Do you ever plan to travel to jurisdiction Y? Does jurisdiction Y have good law enforcement relations with jurisdiction X, extradition treaties, and so on? I mean, but that's another possible life decision. That's today. The other bucket is to hope that a sufficient number of major jurisdictions have some form of regulatory convergence. So what's kind of the best case scenario there, right? The best case scenario is, well, the US is a pretty big market, and they could get to regulatory conversion on that at the federal level. The EU will probably, it's now in the phase where individual member states manage, are testing different things, but at some point at the community level, at the EU level, there will be some regulatory convergence, and so I expect you will be able to issue a token consistently across the EU. Then could you have a potential consistency passporting between the EU and the US? Yeah, probably. That's pretty good. So now you've gotten the EU and the US. That's not bad. Now, is China going to have a regulatory framework? Definitely. Is the Chinese and American and EU regulatory framework going to passport? Probably not. Their financial systems are not integrated today. I don't know that they're going to be integrated tomorrow either, and not for cryptocurrency. So what's my ETA for we have a global integrated system for token issuance? That's a long way away, right? And so I think what you can hope for is if you have a system with an identifiable promoter, and that identifiable promoter is therefore subject to government regulation, and you want to do it fully within the regulatory framework, that's kind of the best that you can hope for, that 5, 10, 15, maybe 30, maybe 50 jurisdictions have consistent regulation and therefore passporting across regulations. And sorry, passporting, just for the folks that don't know about it, say it's countries that have similar regulation on financial topics, and say if you have a license in country X, you can also do that same activity in country Y. It's a passport that you can come through. And so, is that as dramatically as exciting as having a global ICO market the way it was very briefly in 2017? No, I mean, it's more, unfortunately, it's a little bit more tedious and slower. And like with everything else in this field, I think one of the reasons you don't get as a rapid an uptake as you did with the internet is a lot of what is happening in this field ends up not falling under the bucket of speech, as it did with the internet, where you end up being effectively unregulated or very lightly regulated, and so people can develop quickly, and it ends up being put in the bucket of financial services, financial instruments, which tend to be heavily regulated, and you need regulations to come into place, and you need to follow certain checkboxes and what have you. And so, okay, is that frustrating? Sure, it might be, but it's also inevitable. Like it's what's going to happen when people's money is involved. And so it'll take a little longer, but I still think it will happen. Now, what are other ways to look at this? If you're truly decentralized, you could launch globally now. But you have to give something up, right? You can't be there as the promoter. Like, it's not, it's complicated, right? Like, it's hard to get out there now with a truly decentralized product. There's a question here that I'm going to hold this thought for later, but you could do it. If you're willing to give something up, you could launch now. What are you willing to give up? The chance for ICO riches. If you're willing to give that up, you can get global products out, I think, now. What's another way regulators could approach this? You could sandbox it, right? You could give safe harbors. You could say, here is the very fancy legislation for if you want to do a $100 million ICO. But if you wanted to do a $5 million ICO, have it fall under some crowdfunding regulation, have a lighter touch regulatory framework, and manage risk by saying any individual project starts small, and if it starts small and your risk management not by heavily regulating, but you're risk managing by managing the total dollars at risk or euros at risk, that's another approach. So to answer this question, yes, it is nearly impossible to make a global compliant ICO today. I would argue it's not nearly impossible. I would argue it's impossible. If you wanted to make an ICO compliant in every country in the world, it is impossible because most countries in the world do not have a mechanism by which you can make an ICO compliant. So this is a difficult thing to do correctly today. Now, I'm going to skip from this question to where was the question? That was can't find the exact question. Someone asked, can you make a truly decentralized exchange? Maybe this was in the chat. Is it in the chat? I'll answer the question because I think it is relevant. There was a recent SEC settlement where someone made a virtual exchange. They built it on Aetherium. It was a decentralized exchange. It wasn't like a company with bank accounts, and you could send one type of token and get a different type of token back. And it took a commission, and that commission went to the founder's Ethereum account. And the SEC said, wow, that's interesting. You're not running an unlicensed securities offering. You're actually running an unlicensed exchange. You're running an unlicensed broker-dealer. You're unlicensed money transmitter. You're all types of things. And the relatively young person who had launched this was super cooperative with the SEC. And they said, oh, this was great. They did not take any negative action. They asked for the money back, and they cooperated, and it ended all on a pretty friendly basis. But the only reason it ended that way is because the commissions were going to a person, and that person was identifiable, and you could now enforce an action on that person. So let's imagine a somewhat different scenario. Let's say you, from somewhere in the world, on an anonymous basis, you had good operational security, you ran through Tor nodes, you encrypted your connections, you weren't doing it at a public internet cafe with a camera on you, you then throw away your laptop into a pit of fire, whatever. Let's say you did a good job on this topic, and you launched a decentralized exchange, and this decentralized exchange did not get a commission for you. It just ran on Ethereum. You inputted X, you got back Y, you didn't make any money from it. In fact, nobody knows who you is. Okay, now what? I think this is effectively unregulatable in a way. I mean, who is the person you would enforce an action on? You know, normally you would follow the money, and the money someday would end up in someone's bank account. They would spend it, and they say, oh, right, it's Antonis. He bought a house with this money. Let's go chase him around. But if there's no you there, if this is just running as this contract, effectively, this matching engine, effectively, running across the Ethereum network on an ongoing basis, and there's no human at the end benefiting from it, I don't see I don't see legally what could be done. Now, you could tell people don't use it. That's a different thing. You could try and enforce actions against people using it, but that's different, right? There's a difference between saying, hi, I'm Antonis, I'm a casino operator, and they say, no, you don't have a casino license, I'm padlocking your casino. And, hi, here's this virtual casino, and nobody's in charge of it. It's not like we don't know who's in charge, just nobody's in charge. And, well, we can't do anything about that, but we're going to chase around all our citizens and try and keep them from going to the casino. So could you do this? The latter? Sure, but the latter is very difficult and annoying, and there's lots of people in the world and lots of ways they could get to it. So it's usually easier to shut down the casino, not to shut down every individual from going to the casino. So, you know, it's the magic of what Bitcoin did and what Satoshi did, right? Like, if Satoshi had kind of come up and said publicly, right, we're Bitcoin Incorporated and we're going to launch this product and it's going to be called Bitcoin, it wouldn't have gotten traction, I think. I think there would have been regulatory pressure. People would have come and said, what is this? What type of business is this? Well, this is probably some form of a money transmitter, a money service business. Go get your licenses, go get do your KYC and your AML and your blah, 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 blah. And it doesn't get off the ground. The fact that there was no central there with Bitcoin, that it was open source code, that anyone could mine it, that there's no management team to speak of, and so on and so forth, is what allowed it, I think, to get out there into the environment. And it's why the current regulatory stance on it is that it is sufficiently decentralized, that it is not a security, that there is no common enterprise, that nobody is running it, and as such, itself, it's not regulated as an entity. And then on Ethereum, the SEC, and I think they did this in coordination with the European Union as well, ended up sidestepping the issue, because at the time of issuance, I think one could argue that Ethereum was a security, it was sufficiently centralized, etc., etc., etc. However, Ethereum has gotten so widespread, so many people are involved, it would have been, I think, difficult logistically to now conclude that Ethereum is a security and go chasing a whole bunch of people around, including the exchanges, including people who bought and sold Ethereum. So the SEC said something along the lines of, it was probably security when it was issued, but it's now sufficiently decentralized that it's not a security. So please, if you issue something like Ethereum did, like come register, you can't do that. But now we don't have to do anything because we've concluded it's decentralized enough that it's not a common enterprise, that it's not a security. Which is a stance that is practical. That was a practical, I think that was a practical decision by the SEC, and I think the EU had a similar view on it, and so they decided that practically this might be the way to approach it. So I think we haven't seen a major, significant, untethered, autonomous contract running wild yet, but I don't see why we couldn't. Right. A lot of the stuff that people call DAOs aren't really DAO. I mean, you could argue that it's a common enterprise of people, and they're using the term because it sounds neat and there's hype around it. But anonymously releasing code that on an ongoing basis does something productive that benefits only itself, the code, does not benefit a human at the end, I think that could happen, and I think it will be challenging regulatorily to do anything about it. And then I think the regulators will fall back to an approach as with Bitcoin, where they're regulating the endpoints. Right? So I think what they did with Bitcoin is very, very interesting. And I think it provides a useful framework to think about how all this other decentralized, ambitious stuff's going to work. So I say, all right, well, if you have a wallet in Bitcoin, if you send a coin, if you receive a coin, even if you mine, leave aside your tax obligations. Like, you still have your tax obligations if you make money. So your tax obligations aside, if you just do any of these things, what is do you have any regulatory compliance obligations? And the answer effectively is no, You do not. You can download a Bitcoin wallet, send a Bitcoin somewhere, do some mining. You are not a regulated financial services business. Where do you have obligations? Well, let's say you're running a Bitcoin exchange. So there you're at the point of exchanging between fiat, sovereign currency, it's probably more accurate, right? And cryptocurrency. Let's say you're at that point. They say, well, that business is something we understand. It's a company. It's Coinbase Inc. And Coinbase Inc. is a company registered, I don't know, in Delaware, in California, wherever it is. And there's a CEO, and there's a board, and there's shareholders. So great. We know who we're supposed to address. And what does Coinbase Incorporated do? Well, they have a bank account, they take dollars, and they turn those dollars, and they buy Bitcoins, and turn Bitcoins into dollars. So great, that looks like something we've seen before. Here are the regulations that apply to it. So we know what regulations to apply, and they need to be consistent with regulations of similar businesses. So they should fill out their know your customer forms, and they should report suspicious transactions, and they should take appropriate care to protect consumer welfare of their consumers. And not only we know which regulations should apply, we know onto whom we should apply them. All right, if we have to write a nasty letter or a friendly letter or issue a subpoena or sue someone, we know who the person is on the other side of that. We know who the counterparty is. So this is how it has evolved. So people say, okay, well, Bitcoin itself, the Bitcoin network, we're going to let that be. But at the point where the Bitcoin network interacts with the existing financial system, we are going to regulate it as if it is the existing financial system. And I think that's a broadly practical approach. Trying to chase around the Bitcoin users and wallet owners and miners directly, I think would be highly impractical and invasive. I also believe on the other side, if you're expecting that you're going to be a financial services business and be transacting in dollars and euros and yen, and somehow not going to have the same requirements of everyone else transacting in dollars and euros and yen, just because on the other side is Bitcoin, that seems a little bit overly optimistic from your perspective. So if they said, no, in this case you don't need to worry about it, why wouldn't a stock exchange or a stockbroker come and say, great, well, I guess I don't need to worry about this stuff either, right? I mean, if I'm changing dollars into stocks of IBM, and if I'm changing dollars into Bitcoins, why should one have KYC requirements and the other one not have KYC requirements, right? So I think that's where things will settle. So one might think about then what other things could fit in to this concept. This concept being there's a decentralized network that has centralized connections with the existing financial system. And I will leave that as an exercise for the user because it's an endlessly complicated exercise. All right, next question. Similar to the Bitcoin fee for mining, algorithmically, could you create a mechanism to grab taxes in transactions? And could this mechanism be a function of the amount of the transaction? Yeah, for sure. Like, let's say, and I'm not saying it's a good idea from a tax policy perspective, but you could do it. And I'm not saying it's a bad idea from a tax policy perspective. So transaction taxes are proposed often, particularly in financial services, because they look like they might be small. Like, oh, well, if we just taxed 1 cent on every stock trade, think how much money we could make on Wall Street, and why would that change your behavior? It's just 1 cent per stock trade, right? Like, it's no big deal. But let's leave aside whether or not, because this is not asking about a specific tax policy, it's asking if it's technically possible. So, let's say you've launched your CBDC dollar, your central bank digital currency dollar, and that's running on some type of blockchain. And it doesn't matter if it's centralized or decentralized. And you decide the right way to collect taxes, or one tax mechanism you want to have, is a transaction fee. And you say, I want 1/10 of a penny or 1/10 of a percent of every transaction done on my CBDC. I see no technical reason why this couldn't be built into your system, into your digital currency, into your blockchain, into your cryptocurrency, however you've done it, that there's an address, and that address is the treasury, and every transaction that happens sends 1/10 of a cent or a cent or 2 cents or 1 cent to the treasury. And it would work very consistently, I believe. So whether that's the right policy is a totally different question. I think from a technical perspective, I think it's doable. All right. Could Lightning networks that have channels where movement of Bitcoin from node to node is possible be regulated as money transmitters and require AML and KYC? This is a good question, a difficult question. I hope they conclude the answer is no, because otherwise I think that's going to be very annoying for everyone. It's been floated as an idea, right? So I think it's not a very sensible idea, because I'm not sure that they are much different in practice than just doing normal transactions and validating normal transactions and mining normal transactions. So if those things haven't made you into a money transmitter, I'm not sure that running a Lightning node would put you in a different bucket. So nobody has come up with such a policy yet. I've seen it floated online. It caused me to raise my eyebrows. I think that would be the wrong approach. I think it would be a wrong approach because it will hinder innovation in layer 2 payments, and I don't know why you'd want to do that, because I don't see why they're any particularly different than layer 1 payments in substance. And B, it would be difficult, I think, in practice to implement, because then you're chasing around individuals. And all policies relating to digital products that involve chasing around individuals either tend to be not that effective in practice, or for them to be effective end up being tremendous overkill regulatorily, and then you just get into silly outcomes in society, right? Like a great example is file sharing. Any times they've tried to go after the consumers, it has not worked out well. Like they've never been able to control the consumers, and in the times that they got aggressive, you then end up with all these tragic stories that kind of backfire on the music industry, because like now you're going to find some poor family tens of thousands of dollars because, I don't know, their 12-year-old kid was downloading songs, and like really that's a terrible look for the record labels. And so they've had better luck going against the providers, going against the websites, going against the institutional parties. And I think that's practically correct. I think anytime you start going after things that can be done by any individual and an internet connection, you end up in this whack-a-mole situation. And if you then take a sufficiently aggressive approach to tamp that down, you end up overreaching. Because look, all law, all regulation is a trade-off. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. You could probably, take a silly example, speeding in your car, right? We have come to a general balance on how aggressively we persecute speeding in the cars, right? There's some radar detectors and people go out and about and there's some road bumps and a lot of people speed a lot of the time, and once in a while people get a ticket, and if you're super aggressive you'll probably get enough tickets to lose your license, and if you're more or less normal, maybe you won't get a ticket, maybe you'll get a ticket once in a while, and that's the balance. Is that because it is literally impossible to end speeding? No. It's possible to end speeding. If you said anyone who speeds will be taken out and executed on the spot, it would probably put a real dent into speeding. Would that be a popular or proportionate measure? No, probably not. You could say any car sold in Cyprus is electronically limited to 75 miles an hour. Would that be a popular measure? I don't think so, right? So now people are putting in electronic limits on cars, and they're putting them in at 155 miles an hour, which is not a practical speeding situation, right? So you have a trade-off. There's a trade-off between perfect enforcement and how intrusive you'd have to be for that enforcement, and there's a cost-benefit analysis of how important is it to get to a certain level of enforcement. And so I'm skeptical of regulatory approaches for digital products where you have to go after the consumer. You should try and organize the system that the consumer can't easily semi-accidentally break the law, right? I'll give you another example just to end this particular chapter. If you say you shouldn't stream copyrighted video, and I go to YouTube and I play a video and it turns out it's copyrighted, it shouldn't be my problem. There's a question of it should be YouTube's problem or the person who uploads it or whatever, but it really shouldn't be my problem. Practically speaking, you don't want people to be afraid to use the internet. You don't want people to be afraid to use internet technologies. You're going to end up causing more dysfunction, more cost to society than not being in that situation. And so then you have to move it to the level of the issuer or the enterprise or the business, where they're more capable of dealing with regulatory requirements. All right, there's a question here that says, I want to know precisely what part of Africa government is taking part of this great innovation of blockchain and cryptocurrencies. Let's pick that up in week 12. We have a section on the developing world and blockchain and cryptocurrencies, so I think we should pick it up then. All right. Someone linked an interesting McKinsey report, Blockchain Beyond the Hype. And it says benefits from reductions in transaction complexity and cost, as well as improvements in transparency and fraud controls, can be captured by existing institutions and multi-party transactions using appropriate blockchain architecture. And Demetrius, who summarized 3 points from the article on the strategic value of blockchain, I'm going to read them. Blockchain does not have to be a disintermediator to generate value, a fact that encourages permissioned commercial application. Blockchain's short-term value will be predominantly in reducing costs before creating transformative business models. Blockchain is still 3 to 5 years away from feasibility at scale, primarily because of the difficulty of resolving the co-opetition paradox to establish common standards. So that was the strategic value of blockchain, and then, because they're McKinsey, they also said what you should do about it. Companies should take the following structured approach to their blockchain strategies. Identify value by pragmatically and skeptically assessing impact and feasibility at a granular level and focusing on addressing true pain points with specific use cases within select industries. That's a very well-written consultant sentence. And they should also capture value by tailoring strategic approaches to blockchain to their market position with consideration of measures such as ability to shape the ecosystem, establish standards, and address regulatory barriers. Okay. Well, there was a lot of consulting talk in the second bucket. Here's what I think they're trying to say, and it's not really totally relevant for the regulation section, but I'll address it. They're saying you can capture operational efficiency, business value, without disintermediation, without decentralization. And I think that's absolutely true in permission blockchains within specific industries and specific usage cases. And there it is basically an IT problem, not a legal or economic or technological, legal or economic problem. So what do I mean? Let's say today I am a brokerage firm, and in my country there are 15 brokerage firms. And right now we send our transactions by some type of system. And it doesn't matter what the system is, let's talk about what is likely the case and how the system works. I have my transaction database. You have your transaction database. We send transactions to each other, and then we hope that the databases stay in sync, that we're recording the same things you're recording. And this tends to be an annoying and expensive process. Let's say we decided, subject to whatever parameters we decided are okay, to instead keep our transactions in a common blockchain-based, in effect, database. And you might want privacy protections, you might want security protections. This is not an open blockchain. Person X from our live chat on YouTube is not going to be able to jump in to the brokerage consortium of databases and start transacting. But what's nice about having it in a common blockchain is the transactions are naturally in sync. Instead of me recording in my system that you owe me 50 yen and I owe you $100, and hoping that you write in your system that you owe me $100 and I owe you 50 yen, that's in the same system, and so it can't get out of sync. And can you capture business efficiencies from this? In other words, can you save money or increase scale or reduce compliance costs or improve regulatory coverage in a system like this? And the answer, in my view, is absolutely yes. And to link this to this particular topic, law and regulation, does this have any particularly complicated legal issues? I think the answer is no. I think this sits broadly within contract law. I think it's going to be regulated by private agreements between members of the consortium, and they will agree on the terms of reference by which they will collaborate on this blockchain, and that's great. I'm fully in favor. We are absolutely in favor of people using technology to do things more efficiently and effectively. It's good for society, it's good for human development. Productivity growth is the only thing that ultimately drives increases in human wealth. I don't want to say well-being, it's a different question, but certainly increases in human wealth. So, is this something grand, disruptive, decentralizing? No. Do people use the hype from the grand decentralizing cryptocurrency aspects to get funding for their corporate blockchain projects, which might not be so grand and exciting? Absolutely. Is this okay? Yeah, I think so. I mean, enterprise IT database architecture topics are not necessarily the most exciting things, and so if the way to get the budget to do your next generation collaborative database is to say blockchain to the board of directors, and the board of directors have heard of blockchain, and they say, oh, blockchain's important, we know we're supposed to do this. And I'm oversimplifying, right? Like boards of directors of big companies are pretty bright. But there's some truth to what I'm saying. Then that's fine. More power to you. It's a it's a use of the technology. It's a use of the technology in a different context. But that's okay. I have no problem with that. I think legally it is much more straightforward than the decentralized topics. So I'm going to hit one or two questions that I noticed in the questions. Okay, not really sure how to. What are my thoughts about Rootstock? I think it's very interesting. I don't have a detailed point of view. I think it's a very interesting project, and I'd encourage people to look into it. They're addressing some ambitious questions. I haven't studied it carefully enough that I want to take a position one way or another on it, but I note it, and I do think it's interesting. Someone asked, can you conclude that a permissionless blockchain is not a security, but a permission one is maybe a security? No, I don't think that's the treatment. Like in the United States, the treatment is the Howey test. The Howey test looks at a variety of topics. Is it a common enterprise, and do you have expectations of profits and what have you? And could that exist? Could that exist in a decentralized network? Yes, it could. Sorry, in a permissionless. Yes, it could, right? Because permissionless just says you can't censor a transaction. So I think you could have a blockchain that is permissionless, but is still somehow centralized. So this is, I would look directly at what the topics are, what the definition is of a security in your country. It's one type of definition in the United States. There are in Gibraltar and Switzerland and Barbados and Malta more blockchain specific definitions. Like the United States is taking the general principles-based approach laid out in the Howey test and trying to apply it to blockchain-based securities. Other countries have said, here are the tests. This is what's a security token or a utility token or a permissionless or a currency token. And you have to look at the specifics of the test. It's certainly not as simple as permissioned versus permissionless. Another question, I'm going to summarize it together. Let's call it the libertarian question. It says, universally regulated, accepted regulations are unlikely. How effective can fragmented regulations be against borderless cryptocurrencies? Part A of the question. Considering the growth of privacy coins, do you think authorities will be able to regulate cryptocurrencies as efficiently as fiat? Second part. Given the libertarian origins of cryptocurrency, do you think the community will go quietly and welcome regulations, or do you foresee the growth of more privacy and anonymous coins? So I'm going to, we started late, so I'm running a little late to make up the time, but I think I have time to answer this question, because these are all related to one topic. First of all, can regulations be fragmented and still be effective against you, an individual human being? Yes, of course they can. You only need one jurisdiction to arrest you for them to be effective. So if you're doing whatever, Project X, and in 83 countries it's legal, and in another 60 countries there's no existing regulation, and in country Y it is illegal, and you've suddenly gotten on country Y's radar screen, and you happen to be in the airport in country Y, and some very unfriendly people from their law enforcement agency come and put handcuffs on you, who cares if the regulations are fragmented? Because it's almost the opposite problem. If everyone has fragmented regulations and you're the identifiable promoter of that particular token security, what have you, it's like the worst of all scenarios. Like, you could be compliant in 99 jurisdictions and non-compliant in the 100th, and then what? You're going to say, okay, well, I'm just going to avoid that one. And that's fine. That is a strategy, right? Like, there's someone who will remain unnamed in Cyprus who got into trouble with the SEC, and Cyprus constitutionally does not allow extradition of Cypriot citizens. And the U.S. wants him, and he just sits in Cyprus. And so he's fine, but he can't leave Cyprus. So you can think about the pluses and minuses of that. You can say, well, I'm just going to avoid the jurisdiction. Sure, it's easy if your coin potentially violates Namibian jurisdiction. Maybe Namibia's not going to be right on top of you. But usually the most ambitious about chasing people around in these topics are the Americans. And so getting on the radar screen of the American law enforcement mechanism that you are selling unregistered securities to Americans, or unlicensed money transmitting that has something to do with American jurisdiction, it's not great, right? And people have gotten in trouble, and people that previously ran the centralized private currencies almost all ended up, and usually they went to the Caribbean or they went to these other places, they almost all ended up in trouble with the United States. And, they're flying through Miami airport and says, oh, well, come speak with me. Or they get, they go find them in the country that they are. So I wouldn't be so optimistic that it's not a problem for you, person X. Second, privacy coins. Privacy coins are interesting. Privacy coins can probably transact privately in the virtual world of the internet. However, I want you to go through this thought exercise, and this thought exercise is the exercise I actually tell regulators of, you can worry less, I think, about how cryptocurrencies are going to be a big problem for your AML problems, because they're not. I do not think cryptocurrencies are a particularly effective way to do crimes, right? Like, they leave a record. You say, oh, privacy coins don't leave a record. Sure, they don't leave a record so long as you don't want to spend your earnings in the real world, right? So let's say you've come up with the perfect system to avoid paying your taxes, which I do not recommend. I think you should pay your taxes. It's a more sensible thing. But let's say you're running an online business, you're getting paid in privacy coin, and nobody knows it's you, so you're not declaring that income. And you've made $5 million with this great system. And in your privacy wallet, there's $5 million, and nobody has figured out that you're running the business. Nobody has figured out that even if the wallet's anonymous, that your connection to the wallet hasn't been cracked, and you've done perfect operational security and a whole bunch of things that you actually won't do and you'll get wrong. But I'm going to grant for the purpose of discussion that you're going to do them right. So now you have your $5 million untaxed dollars in your privacy coin wallet. Great. Super. What are we going to do with them now? Oh, I want to buy a fresh new performance variant Tesla. I want to buy the S. Okay, great. And it's $100,000. Great. And I go to the Tesla dealership. I was like, great, I'd like to pay you in privacy coins. And they're going to say no. And even if they're going to say no, I accept cryptocurrency, but they're going to say, oh, well, I need to show who you are before I accept $100,000 effectively in cash. And I say, oh, okay, I'm not going to buy a Tesla. I'm going to go stay at a deluxe Marriott in the Seychelles. I'm going to pay with privacy coin. Same problem. I'm going to go buy a house. Same problem. Sure, can I buy certain goods and services over the internet with a privacy coin? Sure, I can. Can I buy the day-to-day goods that I would like to live a life of luxury with my $5 million in most developed countries? No, you can't. And that's where the problem arises in all of these things. That you still, as a human being, live in the physical world, and that physical world has a jurisdiction. And many of the things, if not most of the things that people enjoy spending their money on, are also physically situated. They are houses, education, cars, vacations, fancy meals, yachts, etc., etc., etc. And if there's already regulation about these topics, and it could easily be extended. If you say, oh great, I'd like to buy a house, and I'd like to buy a house and $1 million of cash, the seller's not going to just take a suitcase of cash to sell you the house. The bank, when you show up with $1 million of cash to buy the house, is going to say, well, where'd you get it from? And then go report it to your local regulatory authorities. And the exact same thing's going to happen with your privacy coin. So I believe if you're operationally perfect and have a super smart system, you might be able to collect some money in a privacy coin outside the view of your regulators, but I do not believe you'll be able to effectively spend it, in which case this seems like an awful lot of work to do a bunch of things that could get you in trouble and then not even enjoy the fruits of your labor, so to speak, or your fruits of your semi-questionable, as far as the laws of your countries are concerned, labor. Now, last part of this question. Well, given the libertarian origins of cryptocurrency, true, very strong, do you think the community will go quietly? No, definitely not. The one thing about the cryptocurrency community that I think is accurate is they are not quiet. They make all types of noise, especially on Twitter, right? Like this is, and it's very enjoyable and interesting. You have a very robust set of views and discussion. So no, nobody's going quietly. Will they welcome regulations? They will definitely not welcome regulations. I'm convinced of that. Will they be able to do too much about this? I don't know. The early origins of the internet was also libertarian. I remember when the internet was going to be cyberspace, and the cyberspace was going to be a place beyond the laws of any jurisdiction, and it will be a place where humanity will join together and beyond, the ground-based laws of any jurisdiction. That turned out not to be true, because cyberspace is not really in space. Cyberspace is in servers, and servers are in data centers, and data centers are located on a certain piece of land, and that certain piece of land turns out to be in someone's country. And if it's in someone's country, then their national regulations are going to apply to it. And at the end of the day, if your project, someone can show up with a subpoena and confiscate your server, you are subject to the jurisdiction of that country. You can like it, dislike it, be annoyed by it. That's different. But saying they can't do it is, I think, not accurate. So what I think is a plausible outcome for the cryptocurrency community is to preserve the permissionlessness of Bitcoin and maybe a handful of other cryptocurrencies, so that there are some uncensorable payments possible. I think that's a net good to society, and most of the Western jurisdictions, at least, have accepted and say, like, okay, we're not going to try and regulate these things directly. I believe what will not happen is that you will be able to interact with the existing financial system on an unregulated basis. I think that's for sure. I think what will also not happen is that you can, at any scale and for normal people, be able to operate outside of the taxation system particularly effectively with cryptocurrency. Does that mean there will be no tax evasion in cryptocurrency? No, of course there will be. Is there tax evasion in regular sovereign currencies? Of course there is. Is there tax evasion in cash? Sure. Right? Like why might in some countries people will not give you a receipt if you give them cash, and they'll give you a discount so they don't report it to the tax authorities, put it right in their pocket. So you're not going to get tax evasion to zero in the regular world, just like you're not going to get tax evasion to zero in cryptocurrency. but is it going to be simultaneously a mass product and simultaneously unregulated in the areas that people care about regulation, but primarily taxation and some of this security stuff? No, I don't think so. I think it'd be very difficult because also mass consumers tend not to be libertarians, right? Like, so mass consumers who say, oh, what's super really important about Bitcoin is that it's censorship resistant, they're just going to look at you, right? Like, average person spends exactly 0 minutes worrying about if their currency is censorship resistant. So, to me, this is how it's going to play out. It will be useful to maintain the censorship resistance of a handful, at least, of public cryptocurrencies. I think that's a good idea. And so beyond that, though, we will have to interact with regulators, and I'll close with this. The point of this lecture is not to understand all the regulation for all the topics in every country, is to have some sense, though, of if you're doing certain types of things, you're issuing a token, you're exchanging tokens for some other good, these types of things, it's likely to be regulated in your country, or it will be, and you should consult a lawyer before doing it, because then you can decide what your regulatory exposure is, and if you want to do that, or if you want to take some steps to reduce your regulatory risk, or if you want to do it in a different way. And this is an area where you can get in trouble regulatorily, and so you should take steps to avoid doing that, because there's no reason to have that type of excitement in your life. So we'll close off with that. Thank you, everyone, for the session as always, and I will see you next week.